The following podcast contains descriptions of animal behavior and the treatment of animals by humans that some listeners might find upsetting or disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Oh, man. Wow, finally thawed out. I've been in the dark and the cold here in Texas for an entire week. Man, it feels great to be out again. Wait, what day is it? Oh, crap! Shonen Flop Gaiden is supposed to release really soon. Oh man, I don't have much time. I gotta get started right now. Shonen Flop Gaiden is the supplemental podcast to the podcast Shonen Flop, where I go further into depth on topics concerning the manga in question. This time we're going to be talking about... Actually, that's a great place for us to start. The title of this series is Oumagadoki Zoo, which, yes, that is hard to say. I actually had some problems with it too. You kind of need to break it down to pronounce it correctly. So it begins with O, so it's a long O. So imagine you go over a speed bump in the middle of the O sound. O, maga, which, you know, sounds like those people here in the United States. And then Doki, which is just like, you know, like Doki Doki Panic or Doki Doki Literature Club. It's just Doki. Oumagadoki Zoo. And while we're on this topic real quick, it's not owie. Guys, I mean, I get not being able to get Oumagadoki. It's hard. But I specifically told you that it's 3 syllables. It's not owie. It's not something, oh, oops, I made an owie. No. Aoi in Japanese, it means blue or green, because those are considered shades of the same color there. It's a common girl's name. It's actually a lot easier to pronounce than you think it is. You just gotta make sure you don't say ow, because ow doesn't exist in the Japanese language. It's ow. So just practice going between ow, 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 like that. And the E part at the end, it comes super easily. So aoi. Hana, aoi. But anyway, whatever, that's besides the point. I really don't want to go into way too much pronunciation stuff this time. Let's talk a little bit more about why it's called Oumagadoki Zoo. In the translator notes in the manga, which I appreciated very much, they were very good, they already mentioned how the ma in Oumagadoki Zoo changes when all the animals change to become the ma in magic, like maho. But it doesn't tell you that the 3 main places where these magical animals are in the manga, the zoo, the aquarium, and the circus, all of them are named after antiquated ways of telling time in Japan. The word Oumagadoki, which is usually pronounced as Oumagatoki, toki meaning time in Japanese, means something like the witching hour? It's a super old-fashioned phrase, but it fits really well for the series since, you know, at 4:44 p.m., all the animals change and stuff like that, so it's a magical time. Then we have Ushimitsudoki Aquarium. Ushimitsudoki Aquarium. And this one is weirder. So, Ushimitsudoki, when it's used in Japanese, usually means like the dead of night or right in the middle of the night or super early morning hours. But the way the word is formed is super weird. First of all, there's the ushi part, which means cow or ox in Japanese. And then there's the mitsudoki. So the doki also means time here, but the mitsu is a way of saying 3. So if you break it down, it literally means something like the 3rd hour of the ox. It's a really, really weird thing that I think refers to some old Japanese way of telling time that took the Chinese zodiac and applied it to hours. So you know like how it's like the year of the ox right now? Well, there used to be like the hour of the ox in Japan. And the Mitsu 3, I guess it was like the third hour of the ox. I don't know. But I guess the author probably liked it because it had a animal name in it too. And then finally we have Yatsudoki Circus. Yatsudoki Circus. And this one doesn't have an animal name in it, but it does preserve an old-fashioned way of telling the time. So by some weird old Japanese time-telling system, this refers to either 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. in the day. But what makes it especially weird is that it's written as the 8th hour. So it has the number 8 in it, but it refers to 2 o'clock. This isn't completely without precedent, though, because English actually has a similar phenomenon where our language preserves an old way of telling time that doesn't really apply anymore. And I'm specifically talking about the names of our months. So probably a lot of y'all know that before the Gregorian calendar, which began in like the 1500s or something like that, we had different ways of arranging the year. And the year didn't used to begin at January. It used to begin in April or March. It depends. That's where April Fools comes from. It's people making fun of people going by the old calendar system and celebrating New Year in the wrong place. But what we call the months in English still preserve some of the old order that the months used to be. So we have September, coming from the Latin word septim, which means 7th. We have October, which comes from the Latin word octim, meaning 8th. Think about the word octave in octagon. We have November, which comes from novim, I believe. And of course we have December, which comes from the Latin decim, meaning 10th, which compare that to the word decimal. Alright, with the nitpicky language stuff out of the way, let's talk about zoos. In particular, let's talk about why this author might have wanted to write a manga about zoos. So, Horikoshi, the author of this series, is not from the metropolitan area of Tokyo, but is actually from Aichi Prefecture, which is between Kyoto and Tokyo. This prefecture is known for a lot of things, including a lot of historical things like Nagoya Castle. Also, Toyota was founded here, I believe. But a huge attraction to the prefecture is the Higashiyama Zoo and Botanical Gardens, located in the prefectural capital of Nagoya. It is the second most popular zoo in Japan after the Ueno Zoo in Tokyo. One interesting note about the Higashiyama Zoo that I found was that the logo for the koala exhibit was designed by Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball fame in 1984. Since Horikoshi spent pretty much all of his school years from elementary school all the way through college in Aichi, you could be certain that he probably went on a bunch of field trips to the zoo. He probably saw the Akira Toriyama logo in the koala exhibit, and I bet he had it in mind when he was talking about a zoo that is wanting to be the most popular in the world but can't quite get there yet. Another aspect of Japanese zoos that is reflected in the series is the decline in popularity of Japanese zoos. Since the early 1990s, Japanese zoos have been getting less visitors and have therefore been getting less funds to maintain themselves. Lately, that's even worse because of the coronavirus. Zoos in Japan are now closed to the public, so they're really struggling to stay afloat. And a lot of them have resorted to things like having live web streams and stuff like that, and also crowdfunding in order to try to stay in business and keep their animals alive and their zookeepers employed. And that brings us to a related topic that was brushed upon by David and Jordan during the main podcast about Japanese zoos and the treatment of animals in general in Japan. David and Jordan noted that some of the attitudes towards animals and towards animals in captivity and the portrayal of the zoo in Oumagadoki Zoo clash with some of the views and values we have as American readers of the series. And reading some of the series, one does give a sense that it's coming from a very different place than an American perspective on zoos and animals in humans' relations to animals. I wanted to look further into it, and yeah, it doesn't seem like we're the first people to really note that. And I'm not just talking about Oumagadoki Zoo, I'm talking about Japan in general. Searching for information on the topic, I found this website called zoochat.com, which is a internet forum devoted to lovers of zoos, because there are internet forums about anything and everything. And there is a topic from there in 2017 called "Why Are Japanese Zoos So Bad?" And in it, the posters on the forum have a lot of criticism towards Japanese zoos, and also share some reasons as to why they find Japanese zoos to not be great. They note that a lot of the enclosures and habitats for the animals are not great. They seem very old-fashioned and unchanged since World War II. David and Jordan noted that the enclosures and cages in Oumagadoki Zoo seem really small and shabby. And that seems to be a thing that people have been noticing about Japanese zoos in general, that they seem fairly unchanged in a lot of ways since World War II. So think about old cartoons from like the 40s and 50s that had zoos in them, and you'd see the old-fashioned prison bars and like that look pretty different from, I don't know if you've been to a zoo in a Western country before, but it's pretty different to what we think of as zoos today. Some people there linked to some articles written in the Japan Times in English. I tried to go into these articles, but there's a paywall up for them, unfortunately. But the headlines are, "Ushering in a new, kinder era for Japan zoos," and "Japan zoos could be an endangered species." However, a poster noted a quote from one of these articles from the Japan Times, quote, "Municipal zoos operate under the Urban Parks Law, which means that their animals are treated the same as other public property, like benches and playground equipment." End quote. Another poster, who is listed as being from Hong Kong, actually says that people are being overly critical, and in fact that Japan zoos are quite a bit better than most of the zoos in Asia. They especially note that they prefer visiting zoos in Japan over visiting zoos in China. Other posters also agree that Japan zoos are much better than China's. And the poster from Hong Kong notes that Asia just doesn't have very well developed animal rights laws like you have in Western countries, in Europe and North America. And they say that zoos in these countries should educate the people there in order to lead to better laws and regulations from the government. Some note that conditions of Japanese zoos have improved in recent years, while still needing improvements, while others talk about how Japanese zoos reflect a very different attitude, a very Japanese attitude towards living space in general. The Japanese are famous for making the most out of small spaces, and the poster is saying that they are applying this mentality to animals in zoos, despite the fact that these animals in nature live in vastly different kinds of environments. But these people outside of Japan are not the only ones who have criticism for Japanese zoos and the way that animals are treated in Japan in general. While looking into sources in English about these topics, I stumbled upon an academic paper from the Kawasaki Journal of Medical Welfare, published in English on May 31st, 2000 by Hiroko Yoshida. Hiroko Yoshida is a Japanese primate researcher who has studied gorillas in the wild in Tanzania, as well in captivity in Japan, as well as in the United States, and wrote this paper in response primarily to an incident in 1999 involving two gorillas at Tokyo's Ueno Zoo that were widely reported on in the mass media in Japan. The essay goes into more details about the incident, but a quick summary is that a gorilla named Genki, a female gorilla, had been transferred from the Kyoto Zoo to the Ueno Zoo in Tokyo as a part of a breeding program 2 years before the incident in 1999. When Genki arrived at Ueno, she was about 227 pounds, but 2 years later, at the time of the incident, she had suffered dramatic weight loss to 132 pounds about. In October of 1999, Genki was reported in the mass media as having performed an act of self-mutilation by chewing off the top joint of her small finger. The staff at the Ueno Zoo explained this behavior and the dramatic weight loss by saying that Genki had been under extreme stress because the male that she had been breeding with, named Biju, had chosen a different female in another group over her, and that she performed the self-mutilation because of the stress of her reduced role in the gorilla hierarchy. Primate researchers, including Hiroko Yoshida, the author of this paper, notes that this explanation of gorilla behavior was extremely simplistic at the very best. Later on, when Genki was going to be transferred back to the zoo in Kyoto, a TV crew was there to film her last day, and by total coincidence, they just happened to witness Biju, the male gorilla mentioned earlier, go through the process of dying. The zoo explained that this was due to a sudden heart attack, even though autopsies later changed the cause of death to death from suffocation. And it later was discovered that Biju, also like Genki, had suffered from a very similar type of dramatic weight loss. Biju was on loan from the Howlett's Zoo in London, which contains the world's most successful gorilla breeding program. The author uses the fate of these two gorillas as a way to shine a light on the differing attitudes between the West and Japan in relation to raising animals and zoos. And the author sharply criticizes the treatment of animals in her own country. Quote, I was involved in this problem as a primate gorilla researcher and came to the realization that, in Japan, zoo animals are regarded simply as breeding machines that are easily replaceable by buying other animals. I found it was really difficult to talk with zoo personnel on how to promote the welfare of zoo animals and to assure quality of life and respect for the dignity of animals. Why is the understanding of zoo animals by Japanese zoo professionals so different from that of Western countries? Surely this difference needs to be clarified before discussions to change this situation in the future can occur. Clearly, Japanese zoos have not kept up with the times, and it is not only a problem for zoos, but also for all Japanese, because sympathy for captive animals as the weak is an indication of our attitude towards all living things, including humans." End quote. The author went on to describe the response by animal researchers in Japan. Quote, "Japanese researchers and scientists, including the author, thought something had to be done to show the world that, 1. We understood and regretted the mistakes that had been made, and 2. We were open to the advice of others so we would not make the same mistakes again. As of November 1999, there were 35 gorillas in Japan, which was an average of 2 gorillas in each zoo. This is an appalling statistic known about gorilla lifestyles, both in the wild and in successful captive situations around the world. Gorillas are not the property of zoos for the delight of zoo visitors. They should be treated with dignity and given as much freedom as possible in the captive situation." End quote. The author talks about how Japan and other countries, such as the United States, treat gorillas in captivity very differently. She explains that in the wild, the Western lowland gorilla live very social lifestyles. They live in family groups composed of an adult male called a silverback, a group of females and their infants. And for 40 years before the publication of this essay, there had been successful breeding programs in Western countries for these lowland gorillas. Quote, "In the United States, basic procedures include the following. Social groupings are maintained. More than 3 gorillas live together as a group. The enclosure used by the animals incorporates 3-dimensional space. Many toys are provided, and improved feeding techniques are used. Various kinds of food, various ways of feeding, etc. These methods are considered to be minimum standards for maintaining the quality of life of captive gorillas, and efforts for further improvements are continuing. Such effort is called environmental enrichment." End quote. The author then contrasts this with Japan. Quote, "The situation of gorillas in Japan is miserable. 33 gorillas are kept separately in 15 zoos. There are only a few zoos that have a group of gorillas consisting of a silverback and a few females, which is the normal situation in the wild. 10 males live alone, and there are 7 male-female pairs. As the gorilla is known to be one of the most socialized animals, the situation of gorillas in Japanese zoos is the worst among advanced nations. For a long time, Japanese zoos did not approve of having their gorillas moved to other zoos because all animals belonging to each zoo are considered to be the property of the zoo owner. For example, in the Tokyo municipal government budget, the live animals kept in the public zoos in Tokyo are considered to be equipment. Every zoo tries to keep its animals for fear of losing property." End quote. Yoshida then talks about this in relation to zookeeping in Japan. Quote, "The organization of Japanese zoos is too close to permit the formation of groups according to the scientific understanding of gorilla behavior. To this day, the old customs of the past, when keepers were traditional caretakers of animals, are still alive, and there is resistance to the opinion of outsiders, such as researchers and zoo experts from other countries. The local national governments also do not actively participate to improve the situation. Although the cost of keeping animals in public zoos is funded by taxes, the general public has no way to know what is happening to the animals until the condition of the animals becomes bad enough to report it by the media. Also, researchers are not informed of the facts about animals. As long as the information about gorillas in Japan is closed to the public,
and the data is not made available to other professionals, their sufferings will continue. I have observed captive apes in Japanese zoos for more than 10 years, and was taught many things by Japanese keepers. Even now I respect some of the old keepers as great professionals, though most of them have already retired. Without a doubt, I would have agreed with their opinions if I had not been exposed to wild animals in American zoos. As a researcher of animal social behavior, it was a pleasure for me to see animals living under better conditions, and the conditions of animals in zoos in the States was clearly much better than that in Japan. The wild animals in some American zoos were just as beautiful as the wild chimpanzees I had studied in Tanzania. I learned the truth about wild animal life there, and I am sure that I have been following the wrong theories used in Japanese zoos for a long time. Though the keepers said they loved animals very much, and I cannot deny the fact that they believed so, I noticed that the animals could have led a much more comfortable life if they had been loved in a different way. At this point, I had to say goodbye to the Japanese Zoo Society, where I led such a large part of my life as a researcher. The problem is that we cannot communicate well with each other, even though that we speak the same language. They see and listen to what they want to see and listen to. The staff in zoos in Tokyo obstinately believe that they are the best and that all mistakes are caused not by humans, but by stupid animals. Though it is clear that Japanese zoos have not kept up with the times, it is not a problem for zoos alone, but also for all Japanese. There are many in the general public who are not keen on visiting zoos because they do not wish to see the poor animals. Such feelings should not be ignored, and I think such a fundamental feeling towards animals can be the means to change the present situation, regardless of the cultural differences between East and West. We can feel joy in seeing happy animals. This is a very important feeling that cannot and should not be forgotten, although people may quickly forget the tragedy of the gorillas in Japan." End quote. Resources I've found after finding this article about Ueno Zoo say that in recent years, the zoo has conducted renovations to replace the old-fashioned cages of the past with new habitats based off of animals' native environments, including the so-called gorilla woods, which were built in response to the incident involving Genki and Bizu. Anyway, that does it for another episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden. I have been your erstwhile host, Tucker Whatley. You can follow me on the internets, specifically the Twitter, at Tucker Whatley. That's at TuckerWhatley. No punctuation. You can also view my personal website, which contains a lot of my past work, at www.tuckerwhatley.com. Also no punctuation, spelt exactly the same as earlier. I'm not spelling it for you again. You can rewind it. Anyway, see you, Space Cowboy. Which this time is... Actually, that's a great place for us to fuck off, phone.